So it's now time to actually work on refactoring our application to use MobX. And what we're going to start with is we're going to take a look at what we're doing here in our use effect. And what we're going to do in MobX is we're going to move this functionality, the responsibility for loading our activities, into our activity store. So what we'll do first of all is we'll go to our activity store. And we're going to get rid of this lame example. Nobody wants to do hello worlds anymore, and for obvious reason, they're lame. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an observable for activities, and this is what we're going to use to store our activities. And we'll set this equal to an empty array. Now, we don't get any errors here, but this is not going to do anything for us, because if I hover over this, then TypeScript has inferred that this is a type of never array. And you never want a never array because you can't really do much with this. We certainly can't push any activities into it or do any of our normal array functions. So what we need to do is give this a type. Now what we could do is specify just an empty array. And if we hover over this, then instead of being never array, it's now got a type of an array. But we can go a step further and we can give this our type of iActivity. So let's do this, and we'll bring in iActivity from models activity. And now, of course, this is going to be of type iActivity array. And what we also want to do is create an observable for our loading indicator, and we'll call it loading initial. And we don't need to give this a type actually, because this is just going to be set to false initially. And TypeScript is smart enough to realize that this is going to be a type of Boolean. And then what we want to do is we want to create an action. Now in MobX, whenever we want to change an observable, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to our API, we're going to get our activities, and then we want to store them in this observable. Now because we're going to be changing the state of this particular observable, our activities, instead of being an empty array, it's going to be an array of our activities. Whenever we do something with these observables, we have to do it inside the context of an action. And what I'll do is I'll just bring in the action from MobX, and we'll decorate our method with an action, and we'll call it load activities. And we'll just create a normal arrow function, and then we can go about the business of going and getting our activities. And first of all, what we'll do is we'll set our loading initial, and we'll set this to be true. And this is going to start our loading indicator. Now, this is MobX, and whilst we wouldn't be allowed to do this in Redux, because we're mutating our state here, this is perfectly valid code in MobX. It's designed to be mutated, and we're allowed to mutate the state, so that's exactly what we'll do here. What we want to do then is use our agent.activities to go and get our activities. And if we go and take a look at what we're doing inside our app.tsx, then let's just copy this into our clipboard and just paste it inside our activity store. Now we're going to need to make some changes to this, so it's not going to be exactly the same, but we can use some of this for our purposes. So we'll need to bring in the agent file, and we can use the auto import to do this. So we'll get our agent from API/agent. So we still want to use our activities.list. And we know our response is actually a type of iActivity array. So instead of saying response here in the len statement, what we'll do is we'll swap this to activities to be a bit more accurate about what's going on here. We don't need to create the variable for let activities, etc., because we have our observable here that we're going to work with, so we can remove this. And then instead of saying response for each, we can say activities.forEach. And then for each activity, we're still going to use our activity.date and split this so that we can make sure our date still functions inside our form. And instead of saying activities.push, what we need to do is use list.activities, because list is a class property, and because we want to access this particular class property, we need to use the keyword list.activities.push. And then we can push our activity into our activities array. And we don't need this to set activities. And instead of using .len, what we'll do, because we're not really doing anything with error handling at the moment, what we'll do is we'll just use a different kind of command, and we'll just say .finally, and this is something that we can use at the end of this particular method, and this would typically come after the len chain of commands and the catch, and whatever's inside this finally statement will always be executed, even if there's an error. And what we'll do is we'll say list.loadingInitial, and we'll set this equal to false. So with this in place, what we can do is we can go back to our app.tsx file. And what we can do is we can literally take all of this away. We don't need this particular method anymore, and what we're going to do is use the method from our store to load the activities. So let's go up to where we're bringing in our activity store. We still have access to list inside our app, so we can make use of this to load our activities. So let's go down to our use effect, and what we can do is we can say activity store .load activities. Now, because we're using a function inside our use effect, then we have to tell our use effect about the dependencies that it needs to run this particular function. So inside our dependency array, which we left empty earlier on so that we could use this as an equivalent to component did mount, what we also need to do is, if we're using functions that or external properties or anything like that, anything that our use effect depends on, we have to specify in this dependency array. So what we need to specify in this case is our activity store as its dependency. And what we can also do then is go down to our activities, and what we'll do for now is we'll pass these activities that we're getting from our store down to our activity dashboard. And if I say our activities that we're passing down is our activity store dot activities, then this is what we're going to pass down to our activity dashboard, which will then pass it down to our activity list, etc. And what we also need to do is get our loading indicator from our store as well. So what we'll do is we'll swap if loading to activity store dot loading initial. So if we go and take a look at our application, what we'll find is that we see nothing at all. No activities. If I refresh the page, no loading indicator, just the empty segments with nothing inside it. And if we go take a look at our network tab inside Chrome, and just take a look and see what's going on, and making sure that even though we're using our activity store, we're still making our request to our API. So let's just refresh this page. And sure enough, we can see our activities are coming back from our server, but they're not being displayed by our application. Now, what's fundamentally important, if I go back to VS Code, when we're using observables and our activities array is an observable, our loading indicator is an observable, it's important that the components that are observing these observables and our app component is observing the loading initial and it's observing the activities, but we haven't told it that it's an observer. Now, one of the packages that we installed was MobX React Lite, and MobX React Lite comes with a higher order component that allows us to turn our React components into observers that can watch for changes in our observables. Now, what we see when we go over to our browser is the initial state of our MobX store, and we don't see the changes, because when our activities are received by our activity store, then it's pushing these activities into our activities array. Once it's complete, it's going to turn off our loading indicator, and that observable is going to change as well. But we don't see anything of it inside our component unless we make our component an observer. So let's go back to VS Code and do this. And what we want to do, we want to come down to where we're exporting our app component, and we want to make this an observer. And we do this by using the observer that isn't allowing me to automatically import it from MobX React Lite. So I'm just going to come up to my components imports, and I'm going to say import observer from, and then MobX React Lite. And the observer is a higher order component. And a higher order component takes another component as its parameter, and then it returns a new component with extra powers. And the extra powers this one has is it's going to be able to observe observables. So let's go down and add the observer higher order component to our app. So we'll say observer, and then we'll make our app an observer of our activity store basically. So let's go back and take a look at our component. And what we can see now is we can see our list of activities. And if I refresh the page, then we also see our loading indicator is taking effect now as well. So that's pretty cool. But what we also want to do is we also want to make our activity dashboard an observer, and any child component that's receiving observables we also want to make an observer as well. Because if there's any changes that take place to these observables that we want to see inside a child component, then we also have to make these child components observers of our store. So let's also go to our activity dashboard, and we'll make this an observer as well. And this time I was able to automatically import it. And what we'll also do, because we're passing down our activities to our activity list, we're also going to make this an observer as well. So let's go to our activity list. I know it seems a bit pointless at the moment because we can see our activities and it all looks fine. But when it comes to making changes to these observables later on, then we are going to need to see these changes inside our child components. So this is a necessary step. And there's no problem with making every single component an observer, by the way. It's absolutely fine and doesn't affect performance at all. And let's just double check to make sure this is fine as well. I'll just refresh the page. We haven't broken anything and we can still see our list of activities. What we'll take a look at next is we'll take a look at the ability to select an individual activity, and we'll move that functionality into our store as well.